everyone. Rather intimate crowd today. My name is Vignesh. I'm the program manager of the projector. And today's session is the restoration talk about Mee Pok Man as part of the Mee Pok Man 20 years program that we put together that includes screenings, talks to bring more awareness to this very important film in Singapore history. So today we are joined by Chai Wei, director of Mocha Laboratories, and Karen Chan, Executive Director of the Asian Film Archive. They work closely together to bring this film into the digital realm. So they'll be explaining a bit more about the work they did, how the restoration is done, why is restoration important, and things like that. And there'll be a short Q&A session after they finish their presentation. So a round of applause to the two of them. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. Really glad to see, even if it's just the few of us here, but I know that you're probably really interested in what we're going to be saying, and I hope that we're able to clear some of your curiosities about the film. So really, this film came about to us when we decided that we were looking at some of the collection, the titles in our collection, and Mee Pok Man being the 20th anniversary last year, we thought it was actually quite timely for us to do something about the film and to bring it back to the screens for, I suppose, a new generation of audience. And so the visual that you're seeing here is really of all the camera and sound nags that came in from Australia, the lab in which Eric Koo had his negatives stored, and it was called Ad Lab. And we brought it over, and the negatives were thankfully in relatively good condition. And that also was something that prompted us to say that we do need to do something about this, because we didn't want the next to get to a point whereby it had deteriorated, and then a lot more work would have to be done. So the whole premise behind the choice of Mee Pok Man was that we recognize how significant and influential the film is, and we wanted to bring it back so that a whole new generation of audiences could actually view it on screen, and also we recognize that the film elements were in working condition that we could actually restore with. The digital restoration process that we've adopted is using something called a digital hybrid technique, meaning that we worked out of the negatives, the analog negatives, and from there, from Mocha's sort of work, they did the digital color restoration, right? And so for Mee Pok Man, we output at the very final product in both film and digital. So basically, we recreated another set of the restored film on print as well as on digital format. Okay. So running very quickly through with the restoration methodology, and this would be things that Yi will probably go into a little bit greater detail, but you can see that there is actually a lot of work that goes behind the scenes. So the first couple of bits whereby you have film repair, washing, and 4K scanning, this is all done at a lab out of Singapore. We unfortunately don't have the resources here yet. And after they've done all of that, whereby they sort of scanned the various what do you call print, yeah, and then it became, when it was digitally encoded, it was then sent over to Singapore for Yi to work with, right? Now, so this is just a flow chart very quickly of some of the work that was done outside of Singapore. And you can see that there is a great deal of manual work. So there's a lot of expertise that goes into examining each frame to ensure that things look good before they move on to the next step. So there's a lot of manual work and very labor-intensive sort of process. Okay, and I won't go into the details because this could actually take the entire day if we wanted to. But this really gives you a clear sort of an inkling of the kind of detailed process that goes into any restoration. Now, so very briefly, you can see that in terms of restoration process, there is a whole lot of science involved. There's chemistry involved, in which you actually when you do the washing and the scanning and all that. And of course, the technological skills to transform that when it gets into the digital sort of process. But I wanted to, I'll leave that technological component to Yi-Wei, but I wanted to talk a little bit about the other process, which is the curatorial and collection management component, which is done by the archive, right? So basically for us, in every restoration, we have to decide, when you decide on a film and you want to restore it, then we have to think in terms of what we can do with the film. And that becomes the curatorial component, because you're going to be investing a substantial amount of money into it, and it has to show forth in terms of what the audience can benefit from the restored work. And a lot of the collection management that comes with it after or in the process of while the film is being restored is all these tracking, the planning of what exactly goes where, record keeping as to the process of what has been done to the film, and after which, where are all the different copies that come back. And even when it was in Singapore, when the film came back to Mocha labs, we worked closely with them to figure out, okay, with the subtitles, what exactly should it look like, how should it, what is the process like. So there's a lot of these sort of details that get into the management of the film, right? But I guess the point that I wanted to make is that restoration does not equal preservation. However, restoration requires preservation, because if we didn't have anything restored, or rather have anything preserved, then there would be nothing to restore. So in this case, we were fortunate that the lab in Australia kept the negatives in relatively good condition. Now, if Eric Koo had not left it at the lab, and maybe if he had by chance left it, say, in his house, and in our kind of climate, which is hot and humid, we may not actually have as good condition negatives to work with. And that would become a problem, right? So in this case, now that we have restored it, we would need to look at what we want to do in terms of preservation. And if we look at the digital preservation component, given that we have now pumped out it in both analog and digital, in terms of digital, you actually require a humongous amount of infrastructure, much more than the analog. We need to look at the new file formats. We need to look at physical strata at very regular intervals to ensure that we can access the digital files. And of course, there's all this knowledge that you need to know with regards to metadata, migration strategies. We have to think about obsolescence. We have to think about curatorial insights. And overall, the environment that we put into it has to be very well managed. And a lot of people would say that, oh, but your digital files take up, shouldn't it be, easier to manage, given that, with the physical prints, you just take up lots of space, and, it's bulky and really difficult, clunky to work with. But it's ironically a lot cheaper with the analog, because we just need to put them in the shelves. You don't move it, you don't touch it, it stays quite stable for years to come. Whereas with the digital, we really do have to do a lot of work to it, and you can see there's a lot more management involved, and we probably need to look at the formats every 3 to 4 years, or sometimes even sooner if the technology changes, right? So within our archiving context, we really what we're trying to do is to preserve the original work. So all of Eric's negatives and all of his prints, whatever that he has, is being preserved. And what we were trying to do is also to eventually provide some access to older versions, so that people can actually see what the film originally looked like versus what it looks like now that it's been restored. And we're trying to sort of maintain some sort of integrity, and I think this, although maybe a little bit might bring about some discussion, but in most archives, what we're trying to do is to maintain a certain integrity of the original within the restoration process, right? So we do want to enable films that are independently made, that would not have commercial interest, to then be restored and brought out to the large screen again for audiences to see, right? And ultimately, we want to ensure that works, there's some sort of context in which the works are seen. So that's why we hold talks and discussions with, say, Eric and the film, the cast and crew, because it makes a difference when they shed light on what the entire process was like, and they share, their thoughts and their sort of struggles, the challenges that they faced while making the film, because that gives that the context in which you're viewing the film in. And I really think that after you've heard a little bit more, and if you're going to watch Mee Pok Man, you'll see it in quite a different perspective, right? And so I just wanted to bring up this example of why some archives are very adamant that the original versions are kept. And if any one of you are familiar with Star Wars, you know that this is the famous argument of how George Lucas changed the film so much that he really made brand new versions of it. And so anyone who's seen the 1977 version versus, say, a later version of 2004 would not recognize it. All right? So if that were the case, then where would they, if we were to restore the film, which would we be basing it on? So that's a question to think about. But the implications of all of this on the archive is that we really are custodians, and we don't own the film, but we're custodians of this particular heritage, a cinematic heritage, and we need to preserve it in order that you can access it. Because if you don't, then you have nothing to see and nothing to research upon. And ultimately, with all the new media that's coming up, it's a continuing challenge for us to actually make the heritage accessible, right? And ultimately, this is all the things that we've been doing, and hopefully, if you've seen, some of you who may have attended the SGIFF last year when the film premiered, this was a post-discussion with the cast and crew. And this one was last week when we had the first screening here with Eric and Kate Tong as part of the discussion. So I'm going to send it over to Ewan. He'll give you a little bit more brief, and then we can have a Q&A after.
Yeah, before I start, maybe I want to ask you a question, actually, about, say, you mentioned something about it's lucky that we had Mee Pok Man preserved in some of the lab. No, as in kept in some in the Australian lab, yeah. Right? So, how many? Do you have a rough gauge on how many Singapore films are not properly kept in terms of percentage? Would you have
I wouldn't have a percentage, but I would very safely and confidently say that very few films, if they're not already preserved with us and they're still kept with the filmmakers themselves, are likely not to be kept properly. It's really the way I think preservation is regarded very low on the agenda of most filmmakers, largely because they are looking for ways to, yeah, you make films to be seen, right? So we have been telling filmmakers, given that you're now doing digital-born material, it is vital. It is even more vital now than it was before when they were, making films on analog, formats. That you really do something and keep your films, even if you're doing it yourself, to keep it well from the beginning. It is. I cannot tell you how many filmmakers have come to us and said we've lost things in the last 4 or 5 years. I can't open up my hard disk. Things have just vanished. I've saved it in multiple versions and I still can't open them. It is a frightening thought, and I think for us, when we have to deal with this quite on a daily basis, it's a worrying thing for filmmakers if they don't do something right from the beginning of their production, to keep the films. And I tell you, many don't do it. They don't keep the films properly at all in terms of the process.